Hello, everybody. My name is Austin with Teachers Starting Fires, and today we have a compelling question that a teacher put out there. The question is, how can I make my lessons more interesting and less boring? Actually, the title of their post. Oh man, I'm gonna start over because I did that in the wrong order. So cancel that.
Okay, just keep going and I'll delete
Yeah.
the front half.
Hello, everybody. This is Austin with Teachers Starting Fires, and today we're answering the question. The title is Your Class is Boring, You Talk Too Much. This was something said to a teacher by one of their students, and so the teacher went out and asked what they can do to make their class more interesting, and we're here to answer that question. And intro music. Okay, everybody, today, before we get started with the question about from the teacher who has the class with a challenge, that's very specific, right? I want to let you guys know about a really exciting thing that we have. It's a limited time thing. Jesse and I are doing a coaching program during the month of October, and it's all about taking the expedition mindset that we've been developing both independently and together as colleagues for the past 10 years and helping other teachers to get the same results that we've been getting. So we're inviting all teachers who are listening to this podcast to apply to this program. We're only accepting a limited number of teachers for now, although in the future we'll open it up to more. So the way to apply is to go to tsfires.com/invitation. That's tsfires.com/invitation, and you'll get more information about this coaching program, and there will be a short and easy form where you can apply. So having said that, let's jump into the question. Jesse, why don't you talk a little bit more about what this teacher is asking?
Yeah, so teacher posts talks a little bit about basically talk to a student that was having a little trouble sitting down in her class and paying attention and is like, hey, what's going on? And basically the student says, your class is boring, you talk too much. And she or he, this teacher, spends a little bit of time explaining to the student, thanks for your opinion, but I need to be in charge of the class. And, you're going to have to be able to pay attention, and we have very limited time. They mention a couple other things, basically talk about their classroom routine, but they say that it boils down to they only have 30 minutes each day, and because of that time limit, it feels like they're a little pressured to do more lecturing, more talking, and try to get that information across. They also talk about how their students are low performing, and they also, they do say at the end they don't want to be a boring teacher. That's their biggest fear, but they're looking for ideas to kind of balance out the fact that they have this limited time, that they think will make it hard to do more creative activities that might be good for a 90-minute or 2-hour block class, and trying to figure out basically how to make their 30-minute class interesting, without talking too much.
Yeah, and I think that the point there, and I want to draw a little bit of attention to this. The teacher says that their biggest fear is having a boring class or being a boring teacher. And I wonder how many other teachers out there have that fear, because nobody wants to be boring, right? This is our career, our passion. We want our students to be engaged, but if a student says directly to your face, your class is boring, oof, I mean, that would really hit you in the gut, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah. I mean, obviously, no teacher wants to have this boring class, or be the boring teacher or talk too much. At the same time, the other thing I see here that I think a lot of teachers have experienced, I know I did for my first couple years, especially as a high school level science teacher at a school where academically most students were really, to be honest, closer to like a fourth to eighth grade level. All of these SLIFE students or students with limited or severely interrupted formal education, and refugee students who maybe, several of them came out of Mexico and had basically been doing agricultural work for the first 5 or 6 years of what was supposed to be their formal education. And so these students come in, and we have this huge amount of growth to do, and the pressure result like this pressure to cover a huge amount of content, and this teacher specifically says they feel rushed because the curriculum says they have to get through a full chapter of this textbook every month. But the pressure to get through so much content results in the teacher feeling that they need to just talk, and and that if they talk enough and they explain it enough, surely students will suddenly start doing better. And this teacher has similar results that I know I had as well that the first year. But that even though they break it down super simple and they even say, like, look, these underlined words are going to be on your test, you really need to learn these. Then they have a test and 70% of the students fail. And they kind of, you then have this unfortunately negative recurring loop where you feel pressure to talk a ton to get the content across. You give a quiz, they all fail. So the next time you spend even more time talking, even more time trying to drive home these points. And then the students are even less engaged with these long lectures or this excessive talking, because it's, just not something that they're used to or engaged with, or I don't want to say capable, but like currently able. They're not currently able to follow academic content that well. And so even though as a teacher who has a college degree and gets studying, your impulse is to talk more,
Yeah.
and then you get negative results, and then you talk even more, and then you get even worse
It's
results.
almost like your teacher instincts are sabotaging your ultimate goal, so you don't succeed you don't help the student succeed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as a person who's great at academics, you sort of like your first instinct is like, well, maybe I just have to do it again. And, I mean, one of the adventure stories, one of the camps I worked at had rifle shooting, and there was a counselor who was really amazing at teaching it, but they had this African refugee who was at summer camp and was not shooting anywhere close to the target. It was like hitting the ground feet in front of the target. And they couldn't figure out why, and they kept drawing all these pictures and hadn't realized that the student had never really seen things written down in kind of a two-dimensional representation. So all this drawing meant almost nothing. Whereas for all the other students at this rifle range, more pictures, more diagrams, more drawings made complete sense and always helped them. So this student, we had to, and he had very limited English as well, was just learning English as a refugee. But they had to, do a very different physical demonstration, and he then became one of the best shots that they'd seen the entire summer. And the idea was that, like, same thing, even though this person is an expert marksman and has taught, 1,000 people or something that summer, his instinct is just to, like, do more and more of the images and pictures, and similar to basically the graphic organizers that this teacher on the Reddit post is doing, and getting no results at all. And the instinct is like, well, maybe the student's just not capable of shooting at all, and actually is incredibly capable, and it just wasn't being done in a way that related to how they were engaged or what they wanted to do.
Right. As you're talking, this reminds me of the experiential learning cycle. That cycle where you start with why, and then you think about what, then how, and then you apply it.
Yeah.
And if a class is only lecturing and note taking, are you really guiding your students through that experiential learning cycle?
Right. Well, yeah, and I mean, I think we've talked about it a little bit before, but the idea in like standard academics is there's so much of that natural human learning cycle, the experiential learning cycle, that is not covered. So this teacher actually describes their daily routine, which is a do now. Um, there's no comment. It might be a do now discussion, or just a do now, a discussion, notes, put them in groups to read the textbook, fill in a graphic organizer, and exit ticket. And while those are all pieces of a standard classroom experience, I'm basically, to me, what I see at this, especially this low performing school, is you're asking them to discuss something they don't really understand. So only the kids that maybe have some understanding are really able to interact. And if you're not able to interact, it's kind of a waste of your time. You're taking notes. Again, if you don't really understand it, more notes, more talking is just more disengagement. And putting them in groups to read the textbook, and I have a pretty big feeling there a lot of the students are just not reading that textbook, even though it's the assigned chapter per month. And then fill in a graphic organizer, which again, like it's just writing. It's just this pretty straightforward spitting out of ideas that if the ideas and facts aren't understood or engaging, you're not actually organizing anything. You kind of just put words where you think they go and maybe you get credit. And finally, an exit ticket. And so, like, all of those things don't really fit into what we would encourage in that adventure education.
Right. So speaking of adventure education, one of the real challenges this teacher has is that they only have 30 minutes for their lesson. And on top of that, because the students talk a lot, there's really only 20 to 25 minutes of instruction in that period. So do they even have time for adventure activities, adventure education methodology here in this period?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, here's kind of where I think a lot of people that first interact with teacher starting fires just see it as adventure education must be a game, right? And we do play games. But in the same way, like you go and do a ropes course, it's not so that you can get better at climbing ropes, right? Or climbing tall obstacles. It's so that you work as a team and you develop, as a person, and you conquer your fears and you build confidence and all these basic things that you should be doing in school anyways. And so that idea of like they have limited time. Yeah, and so maybe you can't take 10 or 20 minutes out of your 30 minutes to play games or anything like that, right? But even if you look at the whole 30 minutes or the whole week, um, with this group, like what I would say is like our triple Venn diagram is basically, you look at your class or you look at your students or you look at a specific class or the whole semester and ask yourself like, I always say like in 10 years, but you could say like, hey, at the end of the semester, we always talk about knowledge, skills, and attitude. And this is kind of the big focus, I think, of this podcast and this response is for that knowledge, skills, and attitude. Basically, in 5 years or 10 years or at the end of the year, how will the students that you have, like, how will they have changed in terms of the knowledge, which is the actual academic content that they know? And the idea here, and that's unfortunately almost all we ever focus on in schools, like how will these students have changed academically if you are like lecturing a ton and finally they take some notes and spit it out and barely pass their tests. In 5 years, will they really have any different academic content? But the other two areas are skill and attitude, right? And so for me, it's like at the end of the year, what physical skills will these students have that they didn't have at the beginning of the year? What physical skills will they have that they can go and apply not just to school, but the rest of their life as well, right? And then attitude is maybe the biggest one in this classroom, it sounds like, is for me, this teacher doesn't want to be a boring teacher, and that's very important. It's a good sign, right? But the attitude that I would ask is like, at the end of this school year or in 5 years, how will their experience in this classroom have changed their attitude about life or about school or about learning, right? And to me, that's the biggest one here is a student that says, like, you talk too much and it's boring. Don't take it personally as a teacher ever, right? Like, that's a student expressing something. And yeah, it's a good sign. Maybe you're talking too much, but really that daily outline doesn't suggest that there's a ton of talking, right? You have a student discussion, you have textbook reading, you have an exit ticket, and none of that is student or is teacher talking time, right? But what the student is saying very clearly is like, hey, what's going on in school is boring, is not engaging. I'm not feeling engaged. And the fact that they're willing to talk with this teacher and not just say like, whatever, I don't care, leave me alone,
That's a
right?
good sign.
Which is right. Like they're willing to talk to a teacher. They're even willing to say this slightly offensive thing to the teacher, whether it's to get a rise or whatever. But to me, a student that says like, hey, you talk too much and class is boring, that's not a bad sign. That's a student who says like, hey, I want to be engaged in school and what's happening right now isn't engaging. And so, like, yes, well, the teacher needs to be in charge of the classroom and needs to be able to provide notes and explain it. More than anything, I would say, like whether it's this teacher's fault at all or completely not this teacher's fault, maybe this teacher has been we're only a couple months in or a month into school, depending where you are. Like this teacher's been handed students who have an attitude that says, I'm not engaged with notes, I'm not engaged with the content, I'm kind of bored at school, maybe school isn't for me, I don't care about this academic content, right? And more than anything right now, I would say if you look at these students, that's the level that needs to be grown the most, right? You can kind of think of it like a three-legged stool almost. Like you have this three-legged stool, maybe these students, whatever grade they're in, are a couple grades short on knowledge. Maybe they're a few grades short on skill, but it sounds like they are many, many years short on attitude, right? That, and until you can start to change that attitude, you're never going to have a student. Like you cannot lecture academic notes to get a student to be more engaged with school, but like and I get that you would be taking some time away from content, but it's the exact same thing in my classroom that I realized, like, even if for a little while I was spending half of my hour-long class just playing these games, these adventure education type games, the same things we played at summer camp and same things we play in teacher professional developments that we do, especially the outdoor kind. But in all these situations, like if you took a week and just said like our one goal this week is for you to enjoy what we do in this classroom, maybe you can't do a full week without getting pushback from administration. But if you even just said like, look, Mondays are going to be the day that we spend learning to like school more, and didn't do anything from the curriculum, or took one tiny piece of the curriculum and talked about like, how does this apply to life? How could you think positively about this? How, and worked on building that attitude, that would start to level off this three-legged stool. But to me, reading this comment, that's the idea, is like if you basically that's the same idea. Like you talk about in kind of our little intro quote, like expedition leaders know they can't coerce people into following them on an expedition. And especially like with youth expeditions, you're going to have that kid that got signed up for this big expensive trip, even though they didn't want it, but they still have to come on the trip and they have to finish it and they have to do their share, or everybody else is going to be carrying their stuff and cooking for them and being miserable, right? And so you can't coerce them into enjoying the trip and taking something out of it, and you can't lecture students into taking something out of school. But what you can do is even specifically say like, hey, I've realized like some of you really don't love school, and maybe that's not your fault. Maybe you've had bad teachers or nobody's ever given you a reason to like school, but we need to take a little bit of time each week or take an entire week and structure it. So like our goal is to build this like positive classroom and build this engagement and build this belief that you should be enjoying and growing from school and taking something away from it. And that would move this class forward very, very far. Because to me, that like, hey, you talk too much and you're boring, that doesn't, like, you can't just then give them an activity the next day and have them all be like, this is what we were waiting for. Suddenly we're very engaged students who love education, right? You have to build up these behaviors and attitudes. And I mean, it's kind of an attitude or a skill, but like, honestly, one of those skills you need in life is to be able to enjoy something that on its surface might not be a great task, right? Or to have fun doing something that might be difficult. And that's kind of the idea of expedition. But that same idea applies to school.
I think you hit on something there, Jesse. That's a really good point of saying this, not just saying this to yourself about how you're going to focus on making the education process more fun and engaging. Say it to the students too. Say to your class, I know that you have not been engaged in this class, and I want us to work together so that we can go forward and change that situation. And here's a plan, and get buy-in from the students. So the students are cued in. They know that this is going to be a different experience. They know to expect something different and new. And suddenly they start to think creatively. They start to wonder, oh, well, what's going to happen now? Because for them, it's been very routine up to this point, and they fall into that routine. And that's, nobody is engaged in a really monotonous routine. But if the teacher says, okay, from this day forward, you can expect the unexpected,
Right.
right? That's great.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, like school to me has always been this semester-long backpacking trip, essentially, right? But I think of that, we have all these kind of classroom behavior methods, but to me, like, so many things that we're taught to do as teachers are a little bit disingenuous.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so I mean, like, one of them is just that idea of like, and I mean, I've done it and it is effective at times, where there's a problem, and so you never call a student out, right? You never want to embarrass a student, But at the same time, like if you have one student who's getting up and walking around the class all the time, everybody else in the class knows it. And so if you try to do this veiled, like, well, some students walk around a lot, so we need a discussion about why we shouldn't walk. Like everybody knows that's a little bit fake. And still is, almost just as impactful, right? Like the student, if they're doing it and they don't mean to be distracting, they're going to be just as embarrassed that they're being called out about it, even if you don't use their name, right? It's a group of maybe 35
Right.
students. But to me, on a backpacking trip, if that same thing, right? You have that one person with a really bad attitude, everybody else on that expedition knows that that person has the bad attitude, right? And I think just being like, to me, kind of resetting an expedition on day 2 of 7, which, really it's like day 1 of 7 for this school year. But like saying at the end of day 1, like, look, we got to have a little meeting. And as a guide, like this might be my fault a little for not realizing it and not realizing that this trip wasn't exactly what you're all ready for. But we're out on the trip now and we do have the entire rest of the trip to get through. Um, and I've noticed, these couple group members, like it's completely fine on an expedition trip to be like, look, these 3 people, we all know they need to do dishes a little bit better, right? And everybody would just be like, yeah, we all know that. Obviously, even those 3 people might be like, well, I'm not happy about it, but that's fair if everybody realizes it,
Right.
right? And so to me, that idea of like being genuine with everybody is like you do have to have positive assumptions. Everybody can do what you're asking them to do. Everybody can perform well. Everybody can have a great time doing it. And then say like, but, that's obviously not happening right now. So as a group, like we need to take a little time to try to fix this. So tomorrow, even though we had 10 miles scheduled, we're only going to hike 2 miles and we're going to really focus on doing it with a great attitude and we're going to take a lot of breaks and we're going to focus on cooking better and getting our dishes down and really practice those. And then we'll make up those extra 8 miles over the rest of the trip. And to me, if you could spend a week or 2 or several Mondays in a row kind of resetting the culture and building up a much better attitude and making it clear that like getting out of that negative cycle of just like the more students fail at the academics, the more you get obsessed on just lecturing the academics. And when you do that, I would say in 5 years, basically, you have almost no change in knowledge because now they're disengaged. They think it's a negative environment. They really don't care what you're doing, right? They might even spit those words out, but nobody's going to look back in 5 years and be like, man, that teacher really got me to understand intellectually that concept, right? No, of course not. You just push it out of your head. Skills, probably almost no change because they're just repeating these rote activities and it becomes more and more talking from the teacher. And attitude, again, if the only thing at the end of the year is that they're a little more bitter about school, like you haven't accomplished anything. But if at the end of the year, maybe they only have 50% of the academic knowledge they're supposed to, but suddenly they love school, they have a much better chance of catching up over the next several years. And same idea to me, even within the same year. Spend a week getting them to want to participate and be engaged, and you could teach the rest of the year twice as fast if you could really build up a good
Right. So
attitude.
you're saying that if you take a little bit of time in the beginning to build your classroom culture, it'll be worth it in the end because you'll be able to cover more ground faster once you have that positive learning culture in your classroom.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it's that same comparison we do with standardized tests and everything. But the idea is like when we only focus on the academics or like passing that quiz, it's the same as only focusing on your destination. And if you're sitting there like underlining words and saying, please memorize these words and spit them out on the quiz so that we can pass, that's the same as like, guys, look, I'm just going to drive you to the end of the trail and we're all going to pretend that we went on the journey, but I have to get you to the end of the trail. And that's pointless. Whereas like even if you're like, fine, like we're going to have an absolutely incredible hike in the first mile of the trail, and then we're just going to hike back that first mile of the trail, and you're not going to get to the destination, but let's face it, we were never going to get there anyways. But you've grown as people, you like hiking more, and you start to build up the actual leg
Yeah.
muscles.
And
um,
one of the
but
important points there that and we won't get too much into it right now, but it's what you just said, but you've grown as a person individually, and that message doesn't come from the teacher. The teacher isn't standing there saying, "Hey everybody, guess what? You've grown as a person here," because no one really is going to believe that. but you're taking time throughout the year to have guided self-reflection as part of your adventure activity. And that's where people realize internally that they are growing.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, our big philosophy is the point of education of the whole system is to get people to develop as much as possible to reach their own potential as individuals and citizens. And being teachers, I think we have a much better feel for if that's happening. And even students, though, like at the end of a year, even without being aware of it, students will know if they had a positive experience and have gained skills and attitudes from the year. And they will also know if nothing really changed. And they might be totally unaware of it, but yeah, like helping people grow as people and become more than they are, to me is the focus of education. We primarily do that through academics, but especially, as we talk about in the world of Google, it doesn't really matter if your students have memorized every fact in the world because Google still knows a billion times more than them. What matters is if you have built up the attitudes and the skills and the approach to life and thinking that they need to be a productive, happy, like joyful, fulfilled member of society.
Yeah, well, Google's so smart, but can Google love? Can
I
can Google sing a beautiful
can
song?
I mean, not for a couple more years
We'll
until
give it
AI
a few
takes over
years,
the
right?
entire universe, right? Yeah. As we always do, we kind of wrap up with well, a little microphone error there. But as we always do at the end of the session, the possible things TS Fires can offer. The two big ones to me, uh, I mean, our lesson planning method with the triple Venn diagram is pretty straightforward. Draw out a triple Venn diagram. Each circle has knowledge or skills or attitude in it, and you want to be in the middle. So think about like, am what I doing today, or with 30-minute classes, maybe look at your full 2.5 hours for the week, and say, over these 2.5 hours, will these students have grown in their knowledge? Will they have grown in their skills, and will they have grown in their attitude, right? And ideally grown in a way that they will be impacted 5 years from now. And I think this teacher will find very quickly that maybe that knowledge bubble is filled in really heavily, and over the year especially, almost no skills are being developed if you're only doing this exact same routine every day, right? And probably almost no attitude is being paid attention to. So use that, and you can immediately start to see a different type of lesson that you're planning. And another thing, obviously, the circle games adventure pack would be really useful. It would lay out exactly like spend Monday every week playing these games for half an hour and then reading, or for 20 minutes and reading the textbooks for 10 minutes. And I think you would be shocked at what a change. I know I was like, I thought, okay, we're just going to sacrifice a ton of academics, but I have to play these name games for half an hour just to build this culture. But the second half hour of my class, they accomplished more than they had over the full hour normally. Because suddenly they felt engaged. They felt like they knew each other. They felt like class was fun. And so then this teacher who let them enjoy school said, hey, can you read this book? And they were like, yeah, we can. And I was shocked at how much my students could accomplish with a little bit. So the Circle Adventure Pack, obviously also going to be useful. And I think that's available still. You can kind of get the sample and then learn more about the Circle Adventure Pack at TS Fires. That's for teachers starting fires, but the website is tsfires.com/stick. And then, of course, like Austin mentioned at the beginning, and I'm pretty excited for this, we have just a handful of teachers currently signed up. But like I'm excited just to know that like across the country there are teachers who kind of get this message and are like, yeah, I want to try like to apply the things that adventure educators use. I want to see how that can be used in my traditional classroom. And I'm really excited to see a couple teachers have signed up, but we have that right now. It is completely free. We're not trying to sell you anything on it, but we're trying to start some consulting conversations with teachers around the country. We want to be able to, set aside a half hour after school or during your planning period and talk to you and get some feedback just on these ideas, get some feedback on what we could offer to help you more, and see if there is something that we can offer with our, about 10 years each experience. in adventure education and in applying that adventure education to academic classrooms of math and science in American schools and abroad. And if you have been interested in what we're talking about, if you're still listening to this section of this podcast, go to tsfires.com/invitation and throw an email in there. You'll get more information, and we'll be able to schedule that conversation with you. A couple survey questions just to kind of find out, like, what would you consider your biggest challenge right now, and then we can schedule those phone calls with you and hopefully just start a really awesome conversation. I know I'm very much looking forward to it. Austin and I are both quite excited to talk to some teachers and see if we can share these ideas on a more one-on-one basis.
And actually, Jesse, I just want to throw in there because you mentioned those two things that we have out there right now: the Circle Games Adventure Pack and the coaching program. And if the person who we're making this podcast about their post, and we're going to go ahead and post a link to this podcast on their post on Reddit. But if they sign up for this coaching program, they will get the Circle Games Adventure Pack, which includes our activities and a 90-page booklet and all kinds of stuff. They'll get that for free. They'll get that as part of the coaching program. So this would be a great opportunity for the teacher who we've been discussing in this podcast, right?
That sounds like an absolutely wonderful offer, and I'm glad that you made it. That's really cool.
Yeah, why not? I think this is actually the first time we've offered something like this, but I think that we should do it. Yeah, let's do it. I'll make the appropriate changes to the website.
Perfect. That's awesome. All right. Well, I believe that is our half hour or so of our commuter-friendly Teacher Starting Fire podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, you're just one adventure away.